What is up, everybody? Welcome back here to the TDR Devy Show. We are talking to 2025 running back class today. We thought we've been through half the season. Let's talk about running backs where they're at. It is extremely deep class. It's a lot of fun. We've talked. If you play Dynasty, we're talking about kind of that reshuffling of that running back position. I know people are going to roll their eyes. We always talk about that reshuffling the running back position, and I saw someone already. You said the 2023 class was that class, but this class has a lot of depth. We're going to be diving into it. We're going to be looking at Jay's top 10. We're going to weave some of mine into that whole process there, and some guys on the outside, guys that you should be aware of too. And when we put this list together, I think we have almost 25 guys. That's how many running backs right now that you're like, hey, these guys could all be somewhat relevant. That's what we're going to do on the show, so stick with us. All right, let's get into it. Let's talk about it. So, as we're looking at just the 2025 class as a whole, I wanted to first go through, before Jay tells us about his process. You all know my process. It's vibes only. We just go by the vibes. We see who the hell beats Ohio State. We rank them higher. That's what we do here on the show. But before he dives into that, I will say this. I kind of touched on it in the intro, very, very deep class, right? And in reality, some of these guys are going to go back. I think some will find like their draft grade and whatever they think that they're going to get their draft position. They might come back, a la, Devin Neal, right? We talked about Devin before. Like a guy like Trevor Etienne from Georgia might be that guy that goes back, right? But right now, when you're looking at it, I mean, we put together kind of a top 12-ish list here for you. And then when you go through the list, you're talking almost about 25 to 30 guys that you're like, man, this is deep. Like this is a very, very deep class. Part of the reason is because we had a lot of juniors last year come back. Travion Henderson, for example, Devin Neal I've used for a couple of times. Jaquez Hunter is another one out there. Raheem Sanders, right? Guys like that have not panned out. Donovan Edwards. So there's some guys in that range that like we expect to come out last year that are now all in this mix, right? So when we're looking at the top guys here, the fun thing about this class as a whole is that there's such different skill sets throughout. Like there are truly like this last class that we had, the 2024 class, a lot of bruisers and small guys. You really just kind of have that, not necessarily the best pass catching guys, not necessarily the best 3-down guys, but there are specialists throughout the 2025 class. I think that's what rises them up for me in this class in particular. Like, hey, man, there are really some specialists out there that we can kind of plug and play in your dynasty or in your Devy leagues. So that's what we're going to do. And we're going to talk about this class as a whole, where we're at right now, but also just like, hey, who could you buy? Who do you sell? We'll kind of weave that throughout the episode. But Jay's going to give us his process. He's going to talk about kind of, when he puts these lists together, as we navigate, as we update our rankings over on our Patreon, what are you looking for? So what are we looking for the running backs?
Yeah, so I went through the process in one of our earlier podcasts, and this is just sort of kind of like a little bit of a reminder about what kind of I look for in the data for these running backs or for all the prospects. Basically, the first step is draft capital, and so at TDR we're projecting that out. Even a full year, even the summer before the season, we're sort of projecting that out and basically use the expertise of Kevin and Christian and sites like Mock Draft Database. And so sort of grinding those mocks as we see them come out, where that draft capital should move over time. And what I'm looking for quarterbacks, I'm looking for first round quarterbacks. And for running back, wide receiver, and tight ends, I'm looking for day 1 or day 2. So for rounds 1 through 3 is really important to me for the process. And it's basically just trying to find things that correlate to success in the NFL. And draft capital in the day 1, day 2, that's has the highest sort of correlation towards fantasy relevant success. The next piece is age. So I'm really looking for early declares. It's not a death knell if you're a 4th-year guy or a 5th-year guy, but it's harder to score higher in my process if you're not that early declare, and particularly those guys that are younger but like perform really well in their younger years. That's really what I'm looking for from an age perspective. Athleticism is a very small part of the process. Christian does a really good job of projecting athleticism. You'll through the draft evaluation process, you'll see RAS scores, relative athletic scores, that are out there that I use through the model. But right now I kind of rely on sort of a speed scores. So estimating 40 times and then using your height and weights to try and determine about kind of where your speed scores are. I don't really use athleticism too much in the evaluation process in terms of numbers, except for tight ends. Tight ends, I put a little bit more weighting on that. Size is more of a differentiator in this process. I'll talk about some of the size metrics for running backs as we go through this process. But, looking for basically 205 pounds or greater, and 29, 30 plus BMI for running backs. That's kind of what I'm looking for. But it's more of a differentiator as opposed to something that gets weighed heavily. The film grades right now, how that starts is I just use PFF film grades for all of these players. So the PFF rush gauge for the running backs. But over time, I'll start to, get those grades from Dan Jeremiah, Dane Brugler, put them in the model, and that sort of adds to the process. But right now, we're just kind of looking at halfway through the season what sort of those grades are, and that's kind of PFF gives those numbers. It's numerical, and I can kind of put it in there. And then finally, production. I break up into a couple different categories. The first one is like these age-adjusted thresholds of these metrics that I look for. So how well did you perform on these metrics at each age? And the threshold sort of on most of these kind of goes in an upward sloping diagonal line, and you just basically kind of want to get above the line, above these like minimum thresholds of players that then go on to produce good seasons in the NFL. So for running backs, that's like yards per team play, rush yards over expected, dominator rating, receptions market share. And a lot of those have to do with sort of the market share or how efficient you are at running the ball, but the market share of the offense. And that generally tends to prove out to be something that ends up being good for NFL. And then the other piece is the advanced stats. I call it advanced stats, but really there's a lot of PFF stats. And then there's some stats that I sort of manipulate a little bit in the spreadsheets to kind of talk about. But we're talking about like yards after contact per attempt, missed tackles forced per attempt. In PFF, they have these stats called the breakaway percentage, which is, breakaway runs are basically 15-yard plus runs. And then elusive ratings that they have at PFF. So stuff like that, that kind of all feeds into the advanced stats piece of this. And basically I combine all that into one single number that puts into different tiers for running back. So that's generally my process and how I kind of add and accumulate all that data. Now we're halfway through the season. These numbers aren't final, but what I did was go through now that we're halfway through and put all the updated sort of that info for this season and where they're kind of projecting to be. And that's what we're getting today is sort of this top 10 is sort of an update on that process that I do all summer. Now we're kind of doing a midway update on that process.
All right. I mean, that's part of it. All of this stuff goes into it with GA Sheets, but also, same thing with me. I think I've definitely come over with the PFF grades, and they're not holy art thou. Like, I think that there's always context with everything, but I do think that when you hit certain metrics or thresholds, you're like, hey, that threshold's good. This is what we've seen translate. I can put them in a category, right? Like these are the guys that I'm comfortable with grabbing. Athleticism, RAS, tight ends, those type of things. But let's get into running backs. That's why we're here. Let's talk about number one. And this, full mea culpas for me here. Okay. Ashton Jeanty is running back one. I was maybe wavering on that a little bit pre the season. I was an idiot. First and foremost, because this dude's out here producing 6 games, 126 attempts, 1,200 yards. He's almost to his rushing output from last season on almost 100 less carries, 9.9 average, 17 touchdowns. That is not a typo. That man has 17 touchdowns right now. Only 9 catches, 39 yards in the touchdown. They're really just using him in the running game. They are really trying to get him that Heisman. That's part of it as well. Like they're just giving him the football. And when you look at the numbers, I mean, you want to go deeper. I mean, it is so much fun to look at that, right? Run grade, 98.5. That is one of the highest run grades I've seen over the course of the last few years. Missed tackles force already is at 57. 10 plus explosive runs at 25. Love that. Breakaway percentage, 65.1. So what Jay was talking about a little earlier, yards after contact per attempt is 7 yards after contact. And he has already 911 of those yards are after contact. And elusive rating 318. Like he is dominating right now. He's in a tier of himself. Like I fully believe right now he's a tier of himself. And he's really the only guy getting talked about having that running back round one capital right now. So you got to put him at 1 and you just let it fall where it may.
Yeah, that's it. And I think to that same extent, I was a little bit lower on Jeanty coming in. I go back and look at my summer sort of evaluation on these guys, and I had Genty as at the higher end of tier 3 running back group. And after plugging in all the numbers of what we've seen so far this year and changing his draft capital from something outside of day 2 to now the only running back that's going day 1 in my process so far, he's moved up into a tier 1 status running back for me, which is, I didn't have any going into the season. I had a lot of depth, a lot of tier 3 guys, a few tier 2 guys, and a lot of guys that'll probably do something in the NFL, but I didn't have any tier 1s guys. And I have to move Genty up into tier 1 after what we're seeing so far this season. So far in the index, in the 90s is where the tier 1. So he's a 0.94 in that index, which puts him in the Bijan Robinson level of a prospect. So and that's just looking at the numbers, right? So you're going to have draft evaluation process. You're going to have people that are, very into his game. But if you just look at the numbers, how much the market share he has, and all that goes into that, it's pretty remarkable, the kind of stuff that he's put up. And so you have to put him in sort of that Bijan tier sort of thing. Last year, I didn't have anybody in tier 1. I didn't have anybody in tier 2. Jonathan Brooks and Trey Benson were tier 3 guys, tier 3 for me. And I was excited about them. I was really excited about them. And then the year before, I had Bijan in tier 1 and Gibbs in tier 2. And a few other guys in tier 2, but that was kind of how the process worked out. But this Genty right now I'm really excited about him being tier 1. I do think in your fantasy rookie drafts now, I think you have to consider him at 1.01, even in superflex formats. I think you're going to have to do that, especially if it continues at this pace. It's a really juicy profile for fantasy football. But I'm not sure I would take him there, even in superflex, but I do think that you do have to consider him. He's part of that evaluation now just because of what kind of season he had.
And that is why I'm still on the train of selling Ashton, Genty, and Devy. Like, if you're a contender and you can really go get an elite piece, I mean, I saw some people. I mean, we have combined rankings. I shouldn't say some people. I was trying to get away without talking crap about Christian. But like, he put him up in his like top 4 running backs in Dynasty Devy combined. I mean, if someone's valuing Ashton, Genty at that, I mean, imagine the pieces that you could go grab for him right now on your stretch run. Like, you can hold. That's fine. You can go with him. But you know what? I don't mind selling at peak. And this is kind of his peak right now. I know he's in a tier 1 of himself, but like, I don't mind going there. But that's also some of you guys that out there were buying earlier. You loved him last year, and he was probably a value. Great job. You nailed it. That's what this format is for there. Now, I could probably speak for Jay and myself. After Ashton, it gets a little tougher. I think the tiers are interesting. I think Ashton's in a tier himself because he's the only one out there getting round 1 capital. At running back 2, you have Quinshon Judkins, which I have no complaints there. I think, from just a production standpoint, his first 2 years, it's there. Obviously, splitting time with Travion has been a little different, right? He only has 70 attempts on this year, or 71 at 491 yards and 6 touchdowns. Been okay, kind of doing back and forth. But against Oregon this last week that we're recording this, only 10 attempts, 23 yards, a touchdown. He did have that big fumble that also happened as well. So, like, part of that was Quinshon is just the splitting the work, right? So I think that's the question mark that you have. But I do think that there's a tier after Genty to Quinshon.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree. In fact, going through the model and putting all the numbers in, basically I have 4 or 5 guys in the high 70s that could potentially get into the high or into the 80s. So really, I got Genty in the 90s. That's really my one guy that's probably going to be in the 90s, a tier 1 guy, assuming everything goes sort of the way it has the rest of the season. And then a bunch of guys that have the potential to jump into tier 2, but are kind of floating in between tier 2 and tier 3 right now. And Judkins just happens to be the first of this tier 2 group, just because he did really well in his first 2 years. But I do think that, a lot of the stats and stuff that I look at this market share as a way to measure it. And we talked about this at the beginning of the season. Judkins and Travion Henderson are going to split the load, and the market share is not going to look like a typical market share of a guy coming out that's going to be that high of a pick. because they're splitting it. It's pretty close to almost equal. They're splitting that all the time, and so that's the concern. The other concern that I have on Judkins is the rush yards over expected per attempt. There's another guy where I'm going to hold that in discussion for a few seconds, but Judkins right now, his rush yards over expected for his career has really tailed off this last year at starting at Ohio State, and so his career rush yards over expected is now below 0. And that's one thing that sticks out to me as something that is a watch item, and maybe a reason why this guy could fall a little bit in my group of 4 or 5 guys that I have here in the high 70s. And maybe you could make a case for some of the other guys here to move up. But right now, if you look at Judkins on an age-adjusted basis for the first 2 years when he's playing at Ole Miss, there is a lot of things to like that he was meeting on those age-adjusted basis. And this year we have sort of the exception year, the teammate year, where you really do have a true share of 2 fairly or elite guys. And so it doesn't show up on the market share that you'd like to see, that you'd normally see from these guys that are getting drafted this high.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like, he's looked good. Like, we've seen this before, though. It makes me nervous. Do you remember Isaiah Spiller? You remember Isaiah Spiller because people had Isaiah Spiller as kind of being that guy. He had a great first year. The production was there. That's really the comp. I'm not saying that athletically Judkins is Isaiah Spiller because I think Judkins is more athletic. I think it's going to come down with this group, this tiers of athleticism, the testing. How does that look? But Judkins especially because the split work for him and Henderson are going to be a problem. It's just going to be an issue this whole year with the production side. From a health standpoint, they keep each other fresh. That's great. I want Henderson to stay healthy there. But yeah, you hit it on the head there. I think that from his first couple years, hey, Ole Miss looked pretty good. I would argue last year looked worse, right? That 1,100 yards, the 271 attempts, yards average went down, yards after contact went down, yards per attempt went down. Now people are they're going to always use that excuse. The O-line wasn't great, and it wasn't at the beginning of the year. They gelled. But I do think that there's things that you got to mention, like, hey, there's context with Judkins that you're like, hey, I like him. How's that athletic testing going to be? Hey, can he take over some games? Hey, what's going on at Ohio State? He doesn't have that bad fumble. Those things kind of matter. And I think the receiving profile too, because there's a lot of good receivers in this class. Maybe a guy likes, receiving stuff. Maybe Nicholas Singleton's a guy that teams fall in love with because he has that receiving profile as well. So I think that is a fine spot for him right now. I think from an athletic perspective, though, hey, how's he going to test? I think that's a big thing with him. As far as mock draft database, where they have them going, and again, it's very early. They have him still projecting the second round. So if he was to get second round capital, you're excited about that. I mean, that's part of it. Saw the Vikings, the Texans, the Niners again. The Niners are on there all the time. So like if you hear those names, you're excited about that from a running back standpoint, especially second round there. Now, running back 3 this is the one me and I think Jay are going to fight over maybe all season. I don't know. Amarian Hampton, running back out of North Carolina, 6 foot 220, has had a really good year this year. I mean, from a production, that's where Jay's going to yell at me about. He says the production's there, and it's there. 7 games, 155 attempts, 900 yards, and 7 touchdowns. He has looked very good for a North Carolina team that has been very bad, right? And even against Georgia Tech this last week, I could put him on my risers. He's doing great. 18 attempts, 170 yards. From just a stats standpoint, 80.9 run grade, missed tackles force, already 45 this season, which is almost a career high. I mean, he's going to smash his career high from last year of 67, probably in 3 weeks. Yards after contacts look good, 625. Breakaway percentage is okay for a guy his size at 45%. Elusive rating is okay at 129. So from a standpoint, yeah, he looked good, right? Receiving, he does have receiving ability. I don't think it's amazing, but he can do that. You saw that last year with the 29 catches, 222 yards. Plays for a really bad North Carolina team that plays from behind, and he's still able to produce these numbers. So Hampton's a guy that I think from a production standpoint should be in the top 5. I think I just worry about overall what is his testing going to be, what is his role. But he's a thumper, 6 foot 6'1", 220. If he comes in at that, then I think teams are liking him.
Yeah, I think I was a little lower on him as well. And this is one of those ones where The production sort of is dictating the fact that I have to move him up, type of thing. And it's really this season, he's just having a great season. So if you're looking at all the stats that I look at, like yards per team play, rush yards are expected per attempt, dominator rating, backfield dominator, even reception market share is up over 14.5% this year. And that can be a little confusing sometimes. Really what you're grabbing is, how many receptions of team total receptions, but it's not how well you're converting. So it doesn't really tell you how good of a receiving threat he's going to be in the NFL, just sort of how much of that volume of that offense he is. And it can be manipulated a little bit if North Carolina's passing offense in general isn't that great and isn't involved, which that might be a little bit of the case here. But this season, Omari Hampton is basically crushing all of the production metrics that you look for. And, you're not necessarily somebody that I was incredibly high on before the season, but when that production comes through, and we're talking about, somebody that looks like he's starting to get draft capital buzz, and he has the size and speed combo, and just sort of makes a little sense to keep moving him up these things. And in our last mock draft, I had him sort of as a placeholder as the 12th pick, but really it could have been one of any running backs. And now since then, he just gone on to just produce more and more. So I think you, because of all this positive momentum, you kind of got to keep him up here for the time being. Even though we do have a little bit of reservations, that same reservation that I mentioned about Quinshon Judkins, I make the same comment about Omari Hampton. Rush yards are expected for his career has been at 0 or below 0 for his career. And that's a watch item. Same with Judkins, Omari Hampton, that rush yards are expected. That's the key metric for them. And I'd really like to see that improve substantially coming into the rest of this season and into draft evaluation period.
All right. Yeah, I'm with you there. I think that running back 225 on this list, no matter how you have them, Hampton might be the one that maybe slips out for me. But like they're in their own tier, I think. And when my guy, we'll get into my guy later, that I think maybe can slip his way back into the top 5. But let's get into this kid, because I love this kid. Nicholas Singleton from Penn State. I mean, he's kind of my guy, 6 foot 230, big kid. He's had a pretty good year this year. Although he had a down game against USC, only 10 attempts, 26 yards. But on a season, 63 attempts, over 400 yards, 3 touchdowns. Has looked pretty good this year. 80.0 run grade, essentially. Yards after contact, 233. 10-plus explosive runs at 13 of those runs being there. Missed tackle for is not great at 11. Had a better beginning of the year. I will say the last 2 games are like against Illinois, a really tough defense. Usually he did pretty good. Obviously, like he didn't crush the metrics, but had the 16 attempts, 94 yards, and a touchdown. And I just think he's going to test extremely well. Was a very good receiver. Has shown that this year too. 10 catches, 113 yards, 3 touchdowns. In the game-winning drive, or essentially the game-winning drive against USC to kind of tie it. He was their guy. Like they took him down the stretch. He ended up, in scoring. He was that guy for them. So give me Singleton here. I love him at running back 4. I think he's going to be a value. I think he's going to have a role in the NFL, and I like what he can bring to the table.
I do think so as well. I think this is one of the prospects where the numbers don't necessarily align as much as where I have it ranked. And so this is more Singleton getting like an eye test bump in my process now.
Look at you. I didn't know you had the eye test bump in there.
Well, sometimes you have to, account for some of that stuff as you go through your process, but it's not something I always put in the process, but there is like this eye test that you have where he just looks like an NFL running back when he's out there on the field. And the production that we saw from him early in his career was outstanding. And so really, this is one of those story type of prospects where you have to kind of explain what happened. Year 1 was fabulous, outstanding. He came in as one of the highest ranked running back recruits, and then he goes off and has a fabulous year from all the age-adjusted metrics that you can think of. And then year 2 was really a stinker. Like he may have been injured. The offensive line may not have been that great. Lots of things that can explain year 2. Year 3, the metrics are sort of mixed. It's not like an incredibly fabulous year, but it's not a terrible year. And then you have, like you mentioned, sort of the draft profile and what he can be as an NFL back. I guess this is more of like the hope ranking at the time. But what happens is you have a whole bunch of guys that are sort of grouped in a similar area, and then you can kind of make a little bit of adjustments. Like I mentioned, you had four or five guys here in this range here, and this is maybe a little bit of a bump, maybe a little of a bias from carried over from where I saw from a freshman year, but I still think he deserves sort of being in that top 5 range, and so I have him here at 4. But like there's guys at 6, 7 that could jump over him depending on how this process plays out for the rest of the year. Just like him as a prospect.
They ain't jumping over him, Jay. We're sticking strong together. You and me, eye test. I think your eye test was right. I think that what you're looking at is a player that's going to very well comp over to the NFL side, especially that size. You got to love that size. Even if he comes at 5'10", like let's say he's 5'10", 220. Whoa, okay. And one thing to note, he's been 220 listed since his freshman year. So like I have a hard time thinking that's cooked. Like the books are cooked out there at Penn State and trying to figure out. So I'm in. I think that Singleton's for me still a buy. I love his prospects. I think he's coming out too. I think he's going to get nudged a little bit because Penn State's got some dudes behind him that like they like as well. So like I think that he's going to make his way to NFL. I think he's going to find his way in a team, man. I look around the landscape. That's the other thing I'm talking about. Like you look around the running back landscape. Obviously it's gross, right? Dowdle starting, Zeke's out there. There's other teams. I just hate the Cowboys so much that I just have to throw it out there. Even the Niners going to be in a market for these guys. The injuries just pile up. So like these guys are going to find their role, but I just love that he's been multifaceted. He improved his receiving because he needed to. Okay, hey, he's a pretty good runner in between the tackles this year. Like he's doing all the little things that you have to like there. But let's talk about your 5. Let's talk about running back 5. Yeah. TreVeyon Henderson. So this year has looked really good for the most part. So I think like when you think of TreVeyon and what he's been able to do, and Jay's going to have yesterday's game on his mind for Oregon when we're recording this. But one bright spot was TreVeyon. I think that, when you think of 11 attempts, 90 yards, almost scored a touchdown. He probably should have had that long run touchdown. And that makes you nervous a little bit when you talk about long speed with TreVeyon. We mentioned that a few times. 5'10", 215 this year, 424 yards and 4 touchdowns on just 50 attempts. He doesn't have as many attempts as Judkins. They've really kind of slow played him a little bit, but 15 missed tackles forced, 14 10-plus yard runs. You have to like that. Elusive rating has looked okay, 90.6. You'd probably want to see that go up a little bit more. Breakaways, pretty. When you look at just overall his career, it's pretty. It's consistent. 48 is the highest it's been in his entire career. 47, 44, the other years that he was not injured there. So you have to like it. Obviously not getting involved in the passing game. I think part of that is they're freaking receivers. I hate Ohio State so much. They have the best receiving core in the nation. So they're really not using the running backs that way. Judkins has actually been a little bit more involved in the passing game as well. And I think part of it is just his game script, what it comes down to for Henderson, but he can catch. He's a very, very good receiver when needed. So I don't mind him at 5. You getting TreVeyon at 5 when some had him at running back 1. I think that's still a value. I think he could rise though. I think he could be that guy that rises in this class as well.
Yeah, like TreVeyon, he's in my process. We weight like the early declares
higher.
You hate
old people, yeah.
And so TreVeyon's definitely getting that knock for coming back and doing his 4th year. But there are injuries that kind of explain that. And then, like there's been lots of discussions about like the teammate score affecting sort of analytically how these players play out a season. And we haven't had very many of those at the running back level. I can't think of very many in the recent past where we've seen just 2 outstanding backs in one backfield, really splitting the load and really splitting the carries from an offensive perspective. You had that in wide receivers, and we did use that as sort of exceptions to make a point for analytically for some wide receivers. I think I automatically go back and think about the 4 Alabama wide receivers that were all on one team, and you go and you sort of can make some of the exceptions for some of those guys just because they had to split the offense somehow. and that's sort of kind of that teammate-ish kind of issue that you're having with Junkins and Henderson. And so I don't know if you can or you don't, or however you do your process, but you got to make a little bit of an exception here for that teammate issue that you're having with TreVeyon Henderson and Quinshon Junkins. Henderson, just like Singleton, gets this like freshman year one bump. Probably why I have Singleton a little bit ahead of TreVeyon is just because of the fourth year versus third year. So that sort of explains some of that. But TreVeyon has had some decent numbers. So, year one was really good for him across most of those age adjusted metrics. In fact, all of the metrics that I look for year one, he did well. And then year 2 and 3, it was really, really mixed. Honestly, it was very mixed. And year 4, we're seeing this sort of split with a teammate. So the one exception that I would say is that the rush yards are expected per attempt this season for TreVeyon is much better than what we're seeing out of Junkins this year. So same offensive line, same team actually, and the rush yards are expected that we're getting out of TreVeyon is much higher per attempt than it is out of Junkins. And so if you put a high emphasis on that particular metric, that's something that's pretty interesting to me going forward, even though TreVeyon is that fourth year and Junkins is the third-year guy.
I mean, that's fun to know, right? Those are those little things, those little concepts. Like, hey, same offensive line here, which took a hit. I mean, I think they lost their left tackle for the season too. So let's see how that projects. If you guys haven't noticed, I'm just taking little digs at Jay throughout the show about Ohio State. But he lost his left tackle. Looking at the offensive line, hey, what does that look like? I still think Henderson's a 3-down guy in the NFL. I'm gonna keep saying that. I really truly think that he has that skill set, and he could be a value. I think he's a fun buy right now. I think that people might be trying to lean off of him. I know he's had a good year, but if he has 1,000 yards again, he bounces back his senior year, gets 1,000 yards while also not carrying maybe 150 attempts-ish around there, with Judkins being there, with an offensive line that's maybe a little banged up. I think teams going to be like, hey, we like this kid. Like, we want to kind of buy into that feeling there. So that's their top 5. That's Jay's top 5. It kind of mixed in between mine. Ashton Jeanty, Quinshon Judkins, Amari Hampton, Nicholas Singleton, and TreVeyon Henderson. Now, we're going to go we tiered it a little bit, so I kind of put the next guys from 6 to 12 on here. We're going to highlight a couple as we kind of go through here, but I'll allow Jay to kind of talk about anybody that he wants or anybody else. But best of the rest in terms of that tier. And first, Ollie Gordon, Oklahoma State. Jay's the numbers, the spreadsheets are going to not allow Jay to move Ollie Gordon down. It's going to be the productions there. His love crush, Caleb Johnson from Iowa, finds himself at 7 there. Jonah Coleman, Washington running back, who just tore up my Michigan Wolverines 2 weeks ago. Jordan James from Oregon. Dylan Sampson from Tennessee, a guy that I think you really need to be aware of. I really like Dylan Sampson. We're not going to highlight him, but I could have. I think that's a guy to go out there and watch and see him from this class. Devin Neal from Kansas, and then Trevor Etienne from Georgia, still sitting out there. What's your takeaway from this tier, or you can just jump into your love crush if you want to talk about him as well?
Yeah, so a few observations before I talk about Caleb Johnson, because I really want to talk about Caleb Johnson here in this profile or in this format here. But so I'm tracking 28 running backs right now for 2025, and one observation that I'll make is all but 2 of these guys are greater than 205 pounds, which is basically my weight threshold for these guys. And the 2 that miss right now are Dylan Sampson and Jadon Blue. Well, I don't even know if Jadon Blue is going to come out or not, but Dylan Sampson and Jadon Blue, and those 2 guys, they're above 200 pounds. So we're not even really talking about anything here. But a lot of times when we have we go through the draft evaluation process, you get a guy that's 190 that people are super excited about. And then you have the numbers guys that are saying, he's not over 200 pounds. Well, we don't even have any of these guys that are less than 200 pounds. They're all, at least on their team's rosters page, is above 200 or around 200-ish pounds. So we don't even have to talk about that season, which is I think, a really nice thing to have for us. The other thing is the 2 guys that I have, all these guys are 3-year guys. The 2 guys that I have on here that are the 4-year guys were TreVeyon Henderson and then Devin Neal. Those are the two guys that ended up being the upperclassmen that I have ranked in the top 10. There's a plenty of guys that I'm keeping track of that are in that fourth year or fifth year or even sixth year guys that I'm interested in, but they just don't weigh as well in the process. But some of those guys are having really good years, and they do deserve to be mentioned at some point down the line. And then I'd say this year, the big tier jumpers for me from the summer to now are Genty. Obviously, we've talked about him. That going from tier 3 to tier 1 is crazy. Dylan Sampson, who I had a little bit lower on. He didn't really do too much yet. And then this season, he's having a really good year. And then finally, Caleb Johnson, who I really like. I think he's having a just absolutely phenomenal year. To give you a little bit of a color on him, he's 6 foot, 225 pounds, so 30.5 BMI, perfect for running back. Maybe a little bit taller than you'd hope for, but that's I think a really good size weight index. He probably runs close to a 4.5 40, so it feels okay. He's not like crazy fast, but he's got enough speed there to be sufficient in the NFL. Stats-wise, he had a really good year 1, and then he's now having just a tremendous year 3. It kind of this rise this year kind of reminds me a little bit about Jonathan Brooks and how Audric Estime kind of took rises last year, where you had these 3-year guys that were not like at the high end of anybody's lists, but that if you go back and look at their age-adjusted productions, it was pretty good. But Jonathan Brooks had some exceptions there for Bijan and the tough Texas backfields. But that's the kind of rise that you're talking about. This 3-year guy that looks good on some of these age-adjusted metrics and looks good from a production perspective. That's kind of what you're getting out of Caleb Johnson this year. So just to give you an idea, stats-wise, he's second in yards per team play this year. He's first in the dominator rating on a games played basis in the Power 5. If you get rid of all the clutter and you sort of minimum 77 attempts as a screen kind of thing. He's 6th in PFF rush grade. He's 2nd in yards after contact per attempt. He's 5th in missed forced tackles. He's 1st in PFS breakaway percentage. Those are those 15 plus yards runs. He's 4th in PFS elusive rating. And basically he's rushing for 155 yards a game. Which if you pace him out, kind of like how we did with Ashton Genty a few weeks ago, if you pace him out at that rate, that's an 1,800 yard season. And so, like we're all obsessed with what's going on with Genty. We're all, enamored with Omari Hampton's stats that he's throwing up there, and we're getting excited about that. But I'd argue that Caleb Johnson is having just as great a season as these guys, and I think it's getting overlooked. I do think he deserves to be in people's top 10s. This is one of those guys that if he goes through the draft evaluation process and gets good draft capital, I can see him jumping into the top 5. I think he's that good. The tough game that he had this year, he went against the Buckeyes, and the Buckeyes did a good job stopping him, but he still produced. Even in that game, he still produced and was a major part of that Iowa attack, even though the Buckeyes were really queuing up on him for the whole game. So yeah, I guess my crush this season at running back is Caleb Johnson this year. I love what he's put on the field. I love the stats that he's done. He looks good from a metrics perspective and grading out through my process. I think he's one of those fringe tier 2, tier 3 guys right now. Yeah. And if he keeps it up, he might work his way into tier 2, and I'd be really excited about that.
He's a bigger Tank Bigsby almost. I think that he does have those traits a little bit. And if you like what Tank's doing right now with Jacksonville, he looks like the best running back out there with ETN. Like that's kind of how you're looking at it here. And the production's been there. I mean, he was a sleeper guy. I saw him as a 3-star kid. He goes to Iowa, but these running backs, they produce. And yeah, he didn't have a great game against Ohio State. But Cade McNamara's quarterback, and they had no receivers. Like they were able to just key on. They were just able to key on Caleb. That's just the reality of that defense in the context of the game. But if we're going to talk about a guy that had a good game against Ohio State's defense, let's talk about Jordan James. I think that Oregon running back Jordan James, 5'10", 210. People aren't talking about him enough. I think this year, especially, obviously he kind of split work the last 2 years, 108 attempts last year. Now he has 111. So he has the most attempts of his career, 668 yards, 6 touchdowns. depending on where you look. Run grade right now, 89.3, which is exceptionally well. Yards after contact, 409. Missed tackle for 32 for him. Like, he's been very explosive between the tackles. 22 10 or plus more yard runs. You love that about him. I love his zone gap ability. He does both pretty well. He's a pretty much 60-40 on both sides for the running, where they like to get him the football. Breakaway percentage isn't amazing, 26.8. So that'd be the one, like, that was the Bucky Irving knock. Like, that was kind of like the same thing that you see. People fall in love with Bucky Irving as well. And 110 elusive rating, you have to like that. From a film-based perspective, when you're looking at like what you see on tape and what you like about him, very, like, just a great build, runs hard. And I think one thing that you notice, he processes the holes very well. Like, he's very quick on zone runs, knows where he needs to get the football to. He knows exactly where to kind of explode through the line. Very patient as well, and pretty good burst. I like his burst acceleration in between the tackles. Like, he finds a hole, he's going to get there. Now, I think, pass protection, numbers aren't great. They're not asking him to do a ton there. And then the big question is like that long speed, that home run speed, which I think is overrated. I think if he has a quick burst and acceleration, can make guys miss in between the tackles. But I think that James is one of those guys that if you're asking me like, hey, who could get it in that top 5? I think James can. I think that I would probably have James in my top 5 right now, probably number 5. And just say, hey, I really like this kid. I think he brings a skill set, receiving and rush skill set that I like. If he's really 210, I really like that. Jay's gonna know Oregon's a little iffy about the numbers out there, but if he comes in at over 200, we're happy. 210, 205, I'd be happy as well. But he's a guy that's not getting talked about enough.
Yeah, I agree. He's one of those risers this season. The way that the numbers work for me is he didn't do much year 1 and 2.
Yeah.
And so that's just the gist of it, really. But I like what he's doing this year. This year it looks really good. I had a chance to watch him against Ohio State, and I even typed it in our little Discord thing. He looked really impressive. He looked like an NFL running back. I'm excited that we get another guy to add to our list this year of NFL type level guys. And I do think he earned himself some money. I think he's probably going to get some decent draft capital. So it looks like he's a guy on the rise this season.
All right, let's wrap up the rest. There's more than this. I put as many as I could on the list here. We'll kind of wrap up our thoughts here about the 25 class. If you listen on the podcast, appreciate you guys. As always, we love the downloads that you give us. If you're on YouTube, go check out our podcast, but also leave a like, leave a comment. Where you at with your top 5? Tell us why we're dumb. You guys love doing that. So, like, where are you guys at in terms of where your running backs are at? The best of the rest of the guys basically in this list. We have Jaden Ott, who's been banged up, just been injured. And we talked about him on the panic meter. Like, how worried are we? He didn't play this last week in a loss to Pitt. So that's one thing to note. Katron Allen, he's a teammate of Nicholas Singleton. Le'Veon Moss is a guy that I'm starting to come around on. I talked about a couple weeks last week. I said, hey, this guy's rising a little bit. He was on my Riser episode on YouTube. He's an interesting prospect. DJ Giddens from Kansas State, he ran all over the Sanders ass, the Colorado team this week. Like, he's looked pretty good. That was a very poor rush defense that he played, but very strong running back, very good there. Woody Marks, formerly Jacobius Marks from Mississippi State, he's at USC. Looks pretty good this last week against Penn State defense. That was really good. RJ Harvey, Taj Brooks. I just threw Taj Brooks in here to give Jay some crap because when he said he wasn't very good at the beginning of the year. Jarquez Hunter, I didn't put on the list. Damian Martinez is still out there. Raheem Sanders is bounced back. Donovan Edwards. Jam Miller's another one we could say. Jadon Blue, Khalil Mullings, Kamanganage from Rutgers, Jaquinton Jackson. There's a lot of guys that we could have mentioned here. What's your overall thought of these guys, or just kind of wrap up the episode?
I think there's a few guys in here that jump up. I do think that I listed 12. I think there could be a few guys in here that are NFL level type guys. And so that's even exciting. Even in our past 12 running backs, we still have a group of players that there could be a guy or two that maybe is relevant. And that's really exciting. You don't always get that every year. I mean, we talked about last year how I had just 2 guys in tier 3. I didn't have anybody in tier 1 and tier 2, and a few guys in tier 4. And here we're talking about 12 guys that, probably 1 through 4, and then another, probably 10 or we have 7 up here, but another few guys that even have the potential to be relevant in the NFL. So I guess my takeaway is here, there's just a tremendous amount of depth, and there's a lot of guys even in this group, and some of the guys that you just read off that have the potential to be relevant in fantasy. And so that's just exciting. If you think about where we are in the NFL in terms of fantasy production, there are not that many sure caliber NFL fantasy running back options out there.
Yeah.
And so it's nice to see just a good group, a good depth of guys, and hopefully we get a few of these guys, a couple of these guys end up being dynasty relevant and NFL running backs. So I'm excited about this group. Jaden Knott was my first out here in this group. He's just having a rough go of it this season, and a lot of that has to do with probably being injured. But I'm interested in a guy like Jaden Knott. His first 2 years were tremendous from a production perspective. So that was my first out guy. So I'm excited about him going forward.
God, I want to be so mad at you for not putting Jaden Knott into the kind of the top 12-ish, but I couldn't because the production. Like, we just haven't seen it this year, because I was like, gosh, I was looking at the list. I was like, man, I would throw him in there. Like, and I was kind of going through, okay, who would I put him over? But to be honest, maybe Etienne. I think Etienne's a really weird cut line, because I do think Etienne comes back. I think Trevor Etienne's going to come back for Georgia. Maybe you put him in there. But, I mean, when you're looking at just from a production standpoint and from everything, I think those first 12 guys that we mentioned are, I can see why, right? I can see that. Yeah. But Le'Veon Moss out there is a fun buy out there if you're listening. He got drafted in Devy 2 years ago. I don't think he got drafted last year because of the way the team played out. So he's on some rosters out there. Taj Brooks could be interesting. He looks pretty good. I think, and again, to like the credit here of Taj Brooks, like I think the injury definitely hurt last year. He is a senior, so he doesn't have that. But this year, I mean, I know this is his 5th season, but 124 carries, 679 yards, and 7 touchdowns. His injuries from 2 years ago. He had 1,500 yards last year. So he has had the production. Like, when you're looking at it, he's looked pretty good there. He bounced back this year. Again, has 35 career touchdowns. Receiving standpoint, it's been okay. He hasn't been asked to do a ton there, but I did want to note that. Overall, just the class itself is really, really good. This is deep. It's going to change. This isn't over yet as we're talking about where these guys are going in terms of the running back class, but we appreciate you hanging out with us. But again, let us know where your top 5 are. What are your top 10? Who's your running back 1? I know I'm going to get a bunch of Genty running back 1 comments. That's fine. But how do you shape out those next tiers? What are you looking for there? We appreciate you hanging in with us. We'll see you guys on the next one.